Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Paul Schneider. I'm a priest of the Church of Christ, and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the StarCrest Production Network. Today is day 47. We're providing a general overview to Lumen Gentium, an issue with Dr. Shaun Blanchsrd. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. Before I go through this episode, I want to just note that there was a little bit of recording issue with some of my audio. So this part and some other parts I am re-recording. So if there isn't a slight mix-up in things, I apologize. So we've been going through Vatican II, and there's many documents, and this podcast, and be going through them chronologically, right? We've been going through them chronologically by the date of publication, the final approval. And so now we're getting to Lumen Gentium, which means light of the nations or light to the Gentiles. And it's about the church ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is a fancy word. If you see ecclesiastical, ecclesia, it all goes back to the Greek word for the church, ecclesia, right? And so our guest today is Dr. Shaun Blanchsrd. He is a lecturer at Notre Dame, Australia. He's the author of Vatican II in a Year, that's our podcast. He's the author of Vatican II, A Very Short Introduction with Stephen Bullivant. I actually asked Stephen about this, and he introduced me to Shaun. I didn't know Shaun before this. I went to Stephen and said, hey, this chapter looks good, and I would like to interview for this one. And he's like, oh, actually, my co-author, Shaun, wrote that. So that's how I got Shaun on here. He has degrees from UNC, Oxford, and Marquette. I guess he's excited about Bill Belichick as the new UNC football head coach, as he's devoted to that team. To introduce this, we're going to have 5 parts of the interview. We're going to talk about the Church's sacrament. We're going to talk about key themes. We're going to talk an outline of it. We're going to talk about further documents. And then we're just as a note, Lumen Gentium has 8 chapters, but this interview will only be on chapters 1 through 7. Chapter 8 is on Mary, and it was almost submitted as another document. I'm going to interview another person on Mary in about 40 days because Lumen Gentium is pretty long. So now I want to introduce Dr. Shaun Blanchsrd.
Thank you very much, Father Matthew. I'm excited. Any chance to escape the mediocrity of UNC football is very exciting. So yes, anything.
I remember seeing a little bit for UNC football when I taught at Belmont Abbey College, North Carolina, although it definitely wasn't the number one team among the various local colleges in the South there. But let's get straight into this document. One of the things that Vatican II emphasizes, well, Lumen Gentium specifically, is that the church is a sacrament. Now, all of us, when we did our catechism as little kids, we all learned the 7 sacraments, and the church wasn't one of them. Can you explain what Lumen Gentium means by one of the 7 sacraments, Dr. Blanchsrd?
Yeah, that's a great question, Father Matthew. So the kind of basic catechetical definitions of sacrament: visible sign of invisible grace, special efficacious signs instituted by Christ, that sort of thing. The Eucharist being unique, of course, the Eucharist is what it signifies in a unique way. So you're right to say that when we learn about the 7 sacraments, we don't learn about the church as one of them. The reason that this arose was there was a debate, which I think we'll touch on a little bit more later, but between the first session of the council, the council fathers are looking at this pre-prepared text from the Theological Commission, and they're not satisfied with it for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons, which was articulated by a number of people, but 2 German Jesuits in particular, Otto Semmelroth and Karl Rahner, was they were looking for a kind of unifying principle throughout the document. They wanted the document to be more biblical, both in the kinds of citations and the sort of thought patterns, more pastoral in approach, and also more ecumenical. So one of the ecclesiological concepts that had really been on the rise in the 1940s and 1950s was this idea of the church as sacrament. So Otto Semmelroth, this German Jesuit, had written a book called Die Kirche als Ursakrament. The church is the original sacrament or the primordial sacrament. Of course, also the concept of the church as the mystical body of Christ. There was the encyclical from Pius XII in 1943. That encyclical was sort of the basis of this first draft of the document, which was by the Dutch Jesuit Sebastian Trump, at least the sort of principal author there. So anyway, the church's sacrament really was an attempt to balance these visible, external, and objective signs of the church, concepts of the church, with invisible, internal, and subjective. And the idea of mystery and sacrament, which are etymologically related, were seen as these helpful unifying principles to do that, and then to achieve all the sorts of things that the document sets out to achieve.
Yeah, I think your explanation of a sacrament as the invisible thing that refers to invisible grace really makes it clear how the church is a sacrament, as we get it when it's not just one of the 7 listed sacraments you learned at catechesis. Now, one of the things you noted a little bit, and I think is important for Lumen Gentium, is the history of how we got this document, because this document wasn't just the first proposed one. You mentioned a preparatory document, and then you mentioned several sessions. Can you explain how we got from that initial preparatory document all the way to the final session?
Yeah, sure. So when the Council Fathers arrived, there's a set of pre-prepared documents. They'd been sending in all these suggestions and topics for discussion. The preparation for Vatican II, began really in 1959, 1960 when John the 23rd announced it. There was a theological commission which was headed by Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. Ottaviani was a very traditional neo-scholastic theologian. He was the head of the Holy Office, which is now the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And one of his most important advisors was this Dutch Jesuit, Sebastian Tromp. And they had been very close to Pius XII, and Trump, as I said, had a hand in the drafting of the encyclical Mystici Corporis in 1943. So Dennis Doyle, who has a great article about this, he says, he's a theologian at the University of Dayton. He says the first draft reads very much like an update of Pius XII's encyclical. So there were many positive elements in it, but there was dissatisfaction from many of the Council Fathers that there was a sort of disconnect between the documents that they were receiving and the stated goals of John the 23rd, and also the kind of momentum of the ressourcement movement, of this idea of going back to the kind of symbolic world of the Church Fathers and also directly to the text of Scripture. So, people like Henri de Lubac, Joseph Ratzinger, Yves Congar, people like that. So essentially at the end of the first session, and I know you've already covered Sacrosanctum Concilium, at the end of the first session, there's a quick rash of debate about this document. There's a really important intervention by Maximus IV, who was the Melkite patriarch. So this is the Christians in Lebanon and Syria, and he speaks in French. He refuses to address the council in Latin, but he speaks in French, which was of symbolic importance. And he's very, very critical of an ecclesiology that he sees as unbalanced. He says we really need to supplement and correct this kind of ultramontane paradigm of the Pope as the top of a pyramid, and we need to go towards more of a communio, what we would now call a communio ecclesiology. So Maximus IV was very, very blunt and direct. There was also Bishop de Schmidt he was Bishop of Bruges in Belgium, and he criticized at the end of the first session. He said the text is too triumphalist, too clericalist, and then he said it also has juridicismus, or juridicism. It's too juridical. Now, in defense of the council minority of the neo-scholastic theologians, they would say, well, this isn't the point of an ecumenical council. An ecumenical council isn't actually supposed to be releasing really inspiring catechetical documents. It's just supposed to be sort of stabilizing and proclaiming teaching. So there was also a debate really about what are we doing here? What is the point of what we're doing here? Really important moment. Technically, the council rules where you had to have a 2/3 majority to essentially scrap a text and restart. And they took a vote on whether they wanted to get rid of this first draft it was called De Ecclesia, on the church, concerning the church. And they fall just short of this 2/3 majority. But John the 23rd decides, you know what, I can't have, I think it was almost 1,400 council fathers were not happy about this draft. So he says, well, this is too many. This is too many. We can't proceed with, 60%, 63% unhappy. So on his own authority, he says, all right, let's get rid of this draft and let's go again. So the Council Fathers come back. John the 23rd has passed away in the summer of 1963. They've elected Paul VI. Paul VI is very supportive of the kind of general orientation of the ressourcement party, although he does also take the concerns of the neo-scholastic theologians very seriously. And the new draft, certainly in the eyes of the majority, is a strong improvement. It begins with these famous words, now Lumen Gentium, light of the nations, light of the peoples. And the light is Christ. So the church is the proclaimer of the light, which I think goes along with this theme of the sacrament of salvation. The church itself is not the light, but the church is pointing to the light, and the light is Christ. And I think that connects really well with Dei Verbum, with this idea of God's revelation is actually a person. It's not a book. It's not an institution, but it's actually a person, Jesus Christ. So Lumen Gentium is kind of animated by, I think, a Christocentrism. And there's a number of really important debates throughout session 2 and session 3, but I don't know how much detail you want to go into on those.
That idea there of light to the nations really reminded me of the first chapter of St. John, where John is not the light, John the Baptist is not the light, but bears witness light. Like the church is called to bear witness. And you talked about several of those things. You talked mainly about the first session. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what important developments happened in the later sessions of the discussion about Lumen Gentium.
Sure. Yeah, there's a really kind of dramatic moment at the end of session 2, or in November of so this is November 1963, and the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Frings, is really sort of fed up with Ottaviani and the Theological Commission, and he attacks them really directly and aggressively in a speech. And the author of that speech was actually, or the principal author was actually Joseph Ratzinger. So there's an interesting kind of irony here, where the future head of what is renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is really unhappy with the way that the kind of center of the church is dealing with theologians and local bishops. So there really is a tension between Pope and Curia, which everyone agreed is necessary and important, but then how that's relating to the freedom of theologians and the local authority of the diocesan bishops. So the most neuralgic or a divisive debate is actually over the concept of collegiality, of episcopal collegiality. And at its most basic, this is just the concept that bishops are successors of the apostles who co-rule and co-teach the universal church with the Pope. Now, everyone would have agreed, of course, the Pope has a primacy which comes from Christ. It's not something that people invented for sort of, the College of Cardinals is an ecclesiastical invention. It could be scrapped. It's not instituted by Christ. Everyone agreed the papacy was indeed instituted by Christ. The Pope could, under certain circumstances, teach infallibly, but they thought that the role of the bishop had been sort of perhaps forgotten or perhaps denigrated in certain ways. So this was a really, really tense debate. There was a polling of the bishops that was taken at the end of session 2 on 5 questions that were related to collegiality. And actually the 5th was about reinstituting the permanent diaconate. So, you and I have both taught permanent deacons. So this was the time where the Western Church was trying to say, hey, is this an important facet of our ecclesiology that we've actually lost, which the Eastern churches have not lost, this idea of the permanent, stable diaconate. So anyway, the Council Fathers see at the end of session 2 that there is indeed very, very large minority that believe we need to uphold the primacy of the Pope and also the collegiality of the bishops, the importance of the College of Bishops. And then they have a series of votes taken in session 3. There's a really tense moment. It's called Black Week. At least the majority refer to it as Black Week, where Pope Paul VI intervenes in various ways in order to appease the minority, which is a role that he took very seriously. Pope Paul really believed, I need to get as absolutely close to 100% agreement as possible on all of these documents. So he did some things that upset both sides, which is sometimes a sign of good leadership if you're upsetting both sides. But, they make it through this. They pass the document along on the same day is also the ecumenical document is passed. And so this is a really massive achievement by the council. At the end of session 3, they've agreed in principle. These are some basic orientations. They have overwhelming support. So I do think Lumen Gentium, although there's dramatic moments, there's personality clashes, ideological clashes, it is a real success of the Second Vatican Council. It's a kind of charter document for the orientation of the church.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview of the history of Lumen Gentium. Now we're going to move on to the key themes. Now, the first theme I had listed here on my sheet is the church as mystery, as sacrament, which I think you covered pretty well when we talked about that a little bit before. The second key theme that I have listed is this idea of subsistet in, which is how the church talks about the true church in relation to the Catholic Church, the church founded by Jesus and the Catholic Church. And this is still a debate in theology unto today. And so I'm just going to read the key line here from Lumen Gentium 8, and then I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit of an explanation of what it means, okay? So let's read it. Lumen Gentium 8. This church, constituted and organized in the world as a society, subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter and the bishops in communion with him, although many elements of sanctification and truth are outside its visible structure. So can you give me a little overview of what is referred to as this term subsists in, and how the relationship is between the Church of Jesus, that Jesus founded, and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, okay. So this is a really important shift by the council. So in 1943, Pope Pius XII in Mystici Corporis says the Catholic Church, or the Church of Christ, is the Catholic Church. Now, he wouldn't have denied that there was goodness and truth in the Orthodox churches, in the Protestant churches, and that people outside the church could be saved outside of the visible communion of the church. So this is something that Cardinal Ottaviani, Marcel Lefebvre, everyone agreed under certain circumstances, a non-Catholic, a non-Christian even could be saved. But nevertheless, the shift of the council is to say, on one hand, we're affirming everything that we've affirmed in the past. The church is a society, a societas. It is a visible society. You can point to it. You know where it is. Where is it? It's the places that people gathered around their bishops, celebrating the Eucharist, governed by the Pope and by all those bishops in communion with them. However, the move is to say this church, this fullness of truth, the mystery of the church, which comes from Christ, subsists in the Catholic Church, meaning it is fully present, integrally fully present in the Catholic Church. And yet, this is an opening to ecumenism. It's a move away from triumphalism or from denigrating the other Christians. And yet, many of these elements are present in these other communities. So this is essentially trying to say, we're not departing from our own ecclesiology. We're reaffirming it, and yet we're opening up to what is good and true in the other Christian communities. And I think there was very substantial agreement that something like that was good and necessary, but the precise terms of it were indeed controversial, and I think are still controversial.
I think that's a good explanation. And I see that how we have different churches that have different degrees of this reality, right? The Catholic Church is the fullness, but then when you go to, say, an Orthodox Church, other than that they don't think the Pope is the Pope, on most of the things, 99% of the rest of the doctrines, they agree. But I go to, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they don't even believe in the Trinity, and so it's a lot more different.
Yeah, certainly. And I think we have to keep in mind also that there are actually Protestants present at the council. So especially some of the European bishops in particular have great respect and renewed respect for, say, Lutheran theologians, Anglican theologians, people who are really steeped in the tradition. Whereas I think in some other parts of the world, it's a lot more maybe chaotic. Like what is a bishop in say South Alabama? What is their impression of Protestantism? Well, it might be just fundamentalism. It might be people that are always anti-Catholic, right? So there's an interesting, and in other places, not at all, that people, exposed to people like Graham. So it's a very, very disparate, complicated situation that the council is trying to say something that can apply, in theory, applies around the entire world. But as you say, you have to make judgment calls about what is the nature of this dialogue? Are these people arguing in good faith, or can we learn from these people, etc.?
Another interesting theme that this document, Lumen Gentium, brings up is the possibility of salvation for non-Catholics, right? Because we think of the church as the sacrament of salvation. We think of the church oftentimes as like the boat, the ark, the bark, or whatever, the boat leading us to salvation. But then we have somebody like this Lutheran, this Muslim, this pagan in the middle of the jungle, and all of them have the possibility of salvation. How do we explain that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say Vatican II isn't trying to, it certainly isn't trying to mandate a how. It's trying to leave that open to the debate of theologians. So as I'm sure going back to 15th, 16th century, when you start having missionaries going all around the world. There are various theories, Jesuits like Francisco Suarez, and they learn that there are these pagan peoples. They're not Jews, they're not Muslims, but they're not Christians. These are pagan peoples in the Americas, and many theologians say they could be saved through a variety of means, an unconscious desire for baptism, etc. There's all sorts of theories. So I'd say what's pivotal and what becomes really controversial after Vatican II is, in some way, the Catholic Church wants to say God is the ultimate savior. It is God who saves. Salvation breaks into the world through the life and work of Jesus Christ, through the cross and resurrection of Jesus. And yet, in some way, the church is instrumentally causal in the salvation of those who are saved. Now, that's very obvious. If I'm sure you'll go to heaven, Father Matthew, but if I go to heaven, the manner in which the church is causal in my salvation is very obvious as a baptized Catholic, right? It's probably not difficult to conceive of for a Protestant, the way in which the elements of goodness and truth that are properly Christian and properly Catholic, small c Catholic, would impel them towards salvation, right? But for a non-Christian, that's not so obvious. And this becomes a really important debate after the Second Vatican Council. On one side, Joseph Ratzinger and the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith. On the other side, the Belgian Jesuit Jacques Dupuy. This is probably where this really comes to a head, of two schools of thought that are really trying to be faithful to the council. They take the council very seriously, and yet they have a very tense disagreement about the manner in which a non-Christian could be saved, or how ought we to speak about this.
I think it's important to note that evangelization still matters, because although it is possible that someone out there worshiping this tree or this mountain in the middle of the jungle, unaware of Jesus' salvation, could be saved, his chances aren't that great. Whereas if we bring him into this church, we bring him into salvation, we bring him into a relationship with Jesus, his chance of being saved increase dramatically.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the council and the Catholic theology, Catholic teaching would always say you would always be saved in spite of something. If you're believing false things or practicing false things, and this will go for a Catholic as well, right? You're saved in spite of that. So it's not saying that, world religion is all really positive and great. I mean, you could get that impression from parts of Nostra Aetate, parts of Gaudium et Spes, because they're deliberately emphasizing links and connections and signs of hope. There are negative things in various cultures, various world religions, and the end of Lumen Gentium, Article 17, does give some warnings. It says, the forces of evil are real. Satan is real. People have been deceived, and therefore we must proclaim the gospel to everyone. So it's trying to balance. There are beautiful, good things, say, in Hinduism, even in atheist cultures. You see in Gaudium et Spes, this is really based on a kind of Second World War, post-Second World War Catholic, a serious engagement with atheism. There are atheists who really are striving for the liberation of fellow human beings and for morality, and yet Christ, put front and center in Gaudium et Spes, is the answer to all these longings. So there's an important balance here that you can fall into an undue pessimism, which some Catholics do. I think that's coming back. Or you can fall into a kind of undue optimism where, every religion's the same. It's all the same path up the mountain. And Vatican II is really careful to not be either of those things.
Yeah, it forms that kind of balance. You were talking about before how Paul VI, when he had a vote, it was close. He didn't just say, okay, it just barely passed. No, he went to the people who voted no and said, okay, what changes can we make so we can get it? So it's not just passed by the 2/3 that's needed, but by 95 or 98%. I forget exactly what the percentage was of Lumen Gentium, but I know they're all pretty high like that.
Oh yeah, the final vote. The final vote was a total. I mean, it was 98%. The final vote. Of course, there were moments of great tension, right?
There are moments of great tension. And I remember that the document that got the least on the final vote was Inter Mirifica on social communications. And I at least personally wonder how much that was just bishops thinking, why are we doing a document on social communication?
No, totally. I think that's probably right. Stephen Bolivant, our mutual friend who I co-wrote the short Vatican II book with, I don't know if he's joking or not when he says, the key to the council is Inter Mirifica. I don't know, because everyone says, the key, Lumen Gentium, you could argue, I think I would argue, is the key to understanding the council. Some people say it's De Verbum et Sacrosanctum Concilium, but he jokingly says, "Oh, it's inter mirifica," and I think he's saying, "Oh, well, the church is taking seriously that the world has changed and that we have to engage in new ways." But I think he's maybe reaching. He's trying to, I think, make people laugh in saying that.
I definitely put the priority on the constitutions, the ones like Dave Abram and Gentium and Lumen Gentium and such. But I can see the arguments for all of them. Now, finally, the last topic on the themes was going to be about collegiality and the College of Bishops. So the bishops as a college together, as opposed to individual bishops. Like obviously each bishop has his own authority, but there's a certain authority given to the college as well. And by here, we mean a college is like a group, like the College of Physicians, not the college is like I went to X state college or something like that. No. That's not what we mean. We mean a college as a group. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a little bit ambiguous. It's what is very clear is that the vast majority agreed on certain basic doctrines. That the episcopacy is the highest grade of the sacrament of orders. This was in the very first draft as well. So this is something that everybody was saying. We really need to emphasize this. That a bishop is not just a ordained man who has a lot of responsibility or a lot of faculties or something that the Pope is delegating to do this big job, maybe like a vicar general or a monsignor or something. No, this is actually the deepest reception of the sacrament of holy orders, the final grade of holy orders. The Pope is a bishop, of course. The Pope is a bishop with a special office and a special charism. Everyone agrees on that. When the bishops speak in unison with and under the Pope, not apart from the Pope, but when they speak in unison, they are teachers of the universal church. They are a supreme authority in the universal church. Now, the devil's always in the details, right? How exactly do we verify this, or when is this actually occurring? Everyone agrees it occurs in an ecumenical council, but are there other circumstances where it can occur? How do we know something like the quote-unquote ordinary magisterium has been? How do we verify this? What is the role of the Synod of Bishops? What is the role of the Curate? All of this stuff is really controversial and remains controversial. Paul VI decides really at the last second that they need to safeguard. So the concern of the minority of the more traditional neo-scholastic bishops is this is threatening to papal primacy and potentially to papal infallibility, to the juridical authority of the Pope, to the whole office of the papacy. So they add an explanatory note at the end. It's called the Nota Previa Explicativa. This is very controversial. Young Joseph Ratzinger was not happy about this. It wasn't voted on by the council. It very, very strongly reaffirms the authority and prerogatives of the Pope. But the reason Paul VI did it is that it really moved the minority into the camp of, yes, we will vote for this. We think this is safe. We think this is affirming good things. So for the sake of unity, the kind of statements about collegiality were somewhat diluted by this explanatory note, but it's in the price of essentially unanimity. So that's a difficult prudential call to make there. What is the right move there? The debate rolls on. I mean, synodality is partly about this, right? It's the same sort of basic problem, basic discussion. We're still having it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's really there. And then also Lumen Gentium talks about the different levels, like the lay vocation, lay just meaning not religious or priesthood and things like that. Now, as an outline, the document has 8 chapters. We're only covering the first 7 here. I'm just hoping that you could just summarize each chapter in a few sentences, not an extended period. But the first chapter is the mystery of the church. What kind of like a few sentences or a paragraph, what can you tell us about the mystery of the church, chapter 1 there?
Yeah, so I would say that this is a beautiful, beautiful chapter, and I use this with students just as a kind of intro to ecclesiology. It's deeply biblical. It talks about baptism, that all Christians are baptized into the 3 offices of Christ, the prophetic, priestly, and kingly. It has this ecumenical opening with the subsisted end passage that you quoted. It's deeply Christocentric. It's evangelical. So it's really a kind of summary of sort of salvation history, the gospel, evangelization, and it really sets the tone, the style of the document, what the document's trying to achieve. So I think it's a great success. The second chapter on the people of God is making a really important symbolic point, which is that through baptism, you as an ordained priest, myself as a layman, a nun, a married woman, whoever, we're all the people of God through our baptism. And that is the sort of the first level of our identity as a member of the church, as a baptized child of God. Okay. And we all have different roles. We all have different offices, different duties. Okay. So it starts with that we're all the people of God, from the Pope to the humblest lay person. There is a sacrificial priesthood of which you are joined through the sacrament of orders, Father Matthew. And then there is a priesthood of all believers, which we read about in 1 Peter, and that I am a priest insofar as I offer spiritual sacrifice to God. I don't offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist in the same way that you do, but I participate in that. It also
definitely.
has...
Definitely. Like, I was just going to say, like, I've been recording the ones for Sacrosanctum Utilium, just like before this, and a lot of Sacrosanctum Utilium goes back to active participation over and over again. And the active participation really goes back to the priesthood of lay believers, and the fact that you offer up your own sacrifices, with Christ there in the Mass. And that's kind of connecting these different documents. But
totally.
anyways, you were
absolutely.
That was just a point about the kind of universal or common priesthood of all believers. I think was
totally
kind of connects it to the other documents.
And this is why we don't want to get stuck in. Sometimes people just want to talk about liberals and conservatives or progressives and traditionalists, but actually this doctrine is deeply traditional. In the old text of the Roman Missal, the Latin Mass, my sacrifice and yours. This is a deeply traditional concept. It's in Scripture. It's clear in the Church Fathers that there are different types of priesthood, but that we're all unified in these acts of worship. So there's also in Lumen Gentium 2, there's these kind of concentric circles that are drawn. So Lumen Gentium chapter 2, Article 15, is talking about the relationship of the Church and non-Catholic Christians, and what are the positive points of connection, which, as you said, are very diverse, right? It depends on the person. It depends on the community. Then Lumen Gentium 16 is talking about connections with Jews, with Muslims, with the Eastern religions, and even with atheists who are striving to do what is right and good in light of their conscience. And then 17 is about evangelization, is saying, even though we recognize all these positive things, yet there are still dangers. There's still a need to proclaim Christ to the whole world. Also because you're actually bringing out what is good. So it isn't about a sort of either or. It's about saying what the drive for holiness and goodness that is in a socialist organizer in Paris in the 1940s is Christic. And we're trying to draw that goodness out of the person. This is like Henri de Lubac, The Drama of Atheist Humanism. Okay, so everything that is good and true comes from Christ, and we are optimistic that we recognize this all over the world. Number 3 is really all the stuff we've talked about with offices, the relationship between the Pope and the Curia and the local bishops. Number 3, chapter 3 is not a fun read. It's not a kind of inspiring read the way that chapter 1 is or chapter 2, but it's really, really important. If you're kind of an ecclesiology nerd like I am, you'll really enjoy it. So I really enjoy it. My students, not so much. My students just like when I explain the arguments and debates and I give them the kind of takeaway, but highly technical, very careful. If you've ever sat on, I'm sure you've sat on many committees, Father Matthew. If a committee meeting goes on and on and on and on, and everyone has to add a caveat, that's a little bit how chapter 3 can feel. Chapter 4 is really beautiful as well. I think what Lumen Gentium consistently does well is it brings out the role of the laity and it brings out the role of the bishop. I'm not so sure it does as good of a job with religious or with priests. There were some priests who felt a bit left behind by this because everybody's exalting the bishop, everybody's exalting the laity. Well, what about the guys, the 99% of the diocese of the clergy, right? But anyway, the laity chapter 4 on the laity, a lot of what we now associate with, I'll maybe pair that with number 5, the universal call to holiness. A lot of what we associate positively with the kind of the momentum of the lay vocation, and this can take very different forms. I mean, anything from kind of liberation theology to Opus Dei. These movements of lay people being in the world, lay people being politically active, socially active. What are the gifts of the men and women in the communities? This really brings that out beautifully. Of course, chapter 5, universal call to holiness, is saying everybody is it's not just the people who've taken specific vows, like, you have a promise, I should say, right? You have a promise of celibacy, but I'm called.
We have full vows. Like,
you have
I
vows.
took full
Okay.
vows. I'm a religious in the full sense of the word.
Okay.
We're a congregation, so we're not an order, so we don't have like a monastery where we stay. Like, we don't have stability like the Benedictines, but I took perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in 2009. So
okay. So the full vow of the religious, the promise of the diocesan priest, the married person, the single person, the child, the elderly person, everyone is called to holiness. This isn't about sort of rules or rigidity, but is actually about flourishing and growing into the person that God made for you, your vocation, right? You see, how many times do people come to high schools now and say, every single person in this room has a vocation? Vocation doesn't just mean you're called to be a priest or a nun, but actually is just, how is God calling and directing your life? So that kind of message comes through really beautifully in 4 and 5. I use chapter 5 sometimes in Catholic social thought classes because it's a real positive call to action. Number 6, chapter 6 on religious. This was a tricky one because they're trying to, on one hand, they don't want to denigrate the unique importance of religious life, and they want to root it in Scripture. There was a specific move to say where we can find all these evangelical charisms, evangelical ways of life in Scripture, and it sort of flows naturally from it, even though it's not part of the kind of original constitution of, bishop, priest, and deacon. It's a sort of something that developed out of the evangelical life. So they're trying to affirm that and yet balance that with the fact that they're not trying to say, hey, the people who are called to chastity live in this place and wear these clothes, and then everyone else just kind of, they get prayed into heaven by those people. So that's kind of a misunderstanding you could see in maybe some more traditional Catholic societies at times. They're trying to balance that. Whether they did a good job or not, I think is debated.
And I think things like,
sorry, go ahead.
I think things like that are really response to kind of a lot of the attitudes before that, because you do have that kind of, pray and obey attitude before the council and things like that, which is really like, I'm not that it's, and the kind of just the religious and the priests are called to holiness, but really that idea of everybody. But then also there is a special call within the religious vocation to say, hey, like, I am dedicating my life to Christ, not just to, a husband or wife, depending on whether you're a guy or a gal, and things like that. But anyways, we're on the last chapter, chapter 7, the eschatological nature of the Pilgrim Church and its union with the Church in heaven. So can you give a little summary of that one?
So this is also a really beautiful chapter that I've assigned many times to students, but it's kind of, it's seeing the church as a dynamic dynamic entity, an entity that is journeying through history. So there's a move away from a triumphalism. So the church is not above history. It's not unaffected. It's not looking down on humanity, but it's within the human story. But it's as a kind of leaven. There's a real move towards the image of the kingdom of God, which is of course the centerpiece of Jesus's earthly ministry. That the church is a kind of radical inbreaking of the kingdom of God, and it serves as the city on the hill. It serves as the leaven, and it is journeying through history towards union with, of course, Christ, the triune God, Mary, the church triumphant in heaven with the saints. And there's also a renewed appreciation for eschatology, for the last thing. So of the whole dynamic of the New Testament, because of this biblical ressourcement, is the representation of the church in Scripture is deeply eschatological. It's looking to the final consummation. It is a tool by which God will reconcile the world to Himself, like we pray in confession, right? That God is reconciling the world through Jesus, and the church is the continued ministry of Jesus on earth.
Definitely, I think that's important. And just for our listeners who are not aware, eschatology, eschatological are referring to the end times, both of our own lives and of the world. So things like death, heaven, hell, the second coming, the final judgment, all those kind of topics together is what we're talking about when we talk about eschatology, as I'm not sure everybody would be aware of that term. Now, Now, finally, we're just going to talk a little bit about further documents. You kind of noted how Lumen Gentium is kind of a key in Vatican II, and you wrote the same thing in your book, Vatican II, A Very Short Introduction. You mentioned like almost half the documents of Vatican II are kind of expanding on Lumen Gentium. You wrote Christus Dominus on the Office of Bishop, Unitatis Regeneratio on Ecumenism, Dignitas Humanae on religious liberty, guidance, spes in the Church of the world, Nostra on the Jews, and Religion ad Gentes on missionary work. So you mentioned all of these, like how they're related to Lumen Gentium. How do you see Lumen Gentium as kind of the keystone, and how do you see these as expanding on it in the council? You don't need to go through every single one, but a few of them, what the kind of connection is.
So in preparation for this, I reread a commentary, the one of the sort of quasi-official commentaries that was released just after the council by a group of German theologians, including Ronner and Ratzinger. And they got Gerard Philips, who was the Belgian, one of the principal drafters of Lumen Gentium, to kind of comment on the document Lumen Gentium. And he saw, and he actually wrote the Nota Explicativa, and he kind of defends himself in this overview of why it was necessary. But he sees Lumen Gentium as a kind of authoritative commentary and key for the church ad intra. So looking inward, what are we? Who are we? What does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to be a lay person, a baptized person? What does it mean to be the light, to point to Christ, the light of the world? So it's formally synthesizing and explicating how do we see ourselves as Catholics and how do we see the church. Now, there's also moments where it's looking outward, right? What is our connection to non-Catholic Christians? What is our connection to the world, to non-Christians? Okay. Gaudium et Spes, which is in some ways kind of a grab bag of just so many different topics, but the unifying principle is it's the church ad extra. It's the church in its relation to the world, to non-Christians, to in the political sphere, in the social sphere, etc. So Gaudium et Spes is kind of a part two of Lumen Gentium in that sense, and it makes sense that Lumen Gentium was promulgated first in November of 1964, and only in 1965, after much more debate and drafting and redrafting, were they able to promulgate Gaudium et Spes. They also, in 1965, promulgate Dignitatis Humanae on religious freedom, which is a very important a move away from a triumphalism. And it's really an important ecumenical document. It's saying we're not trying to coerce or civilly penalize non-Catholics, non-Christians. We're fully proclaiming the freedom that we proclaim for ourselves. So Dignitatis Humanae, Gaudium et Spes, Nostra Aetate, which is a building a bridge to other religions by emphasizing the positives of the human search for truth, of God's grace being poured out on the world. And of course, the special relationship with the Jewish people, which at the time, 20 years after the Holocaust and the Second World War, was of really pressing importance for the council. So yeah, you can kind of see a pair of documents in session 3, Christus Dominus, the ecumenical document Unitatis Redintegratio, and Lumen Gentium kind of as a triplet. And then in 1965, you have this kind of ad extra, looking outward. What are our connections? Ad Gentes is a missionary document. So Ad Gentes is really taking up on Lumen Gentium 16 and 17 and giving also practical norms for missionaries. So you can make a good case Lumen Gentium is the key. If you understand Lumen Gentium, you really understand kind of theologically what Vatican II is doing. You can certainly make that case. You could say Dei Verbum as well, because there's this whole view of the person of Christ in Revelation. But
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that most people put Lumen Gentium, Dei Verbum, or Gaudium et Spes kind of in the center and then rotate around them. Obviously, I think when you read each document, it's good to see how their connections are to all the other documents and kind of focus on that one and say, oh, I see how this is connected to that one. This is connected to that one. Like I was mentioning about Sacrosanctum Concilium, even with the common priesthood, because the documents are not just something to read in isolation, but I think there is a kind of value in the interconnectedness, almost like a spider web between them and things.
Definitely,
and there's several documents since then. I just realized, looked at the clock, we're getting a little late, so we won't get into those. But thank you very much, Dr. Blanchsrd. This was an excellent conversation. I really appreciate what you're doing there in Notre Dame. Is there anything else you'd like to share with people beyond your book, The Short Introduction to Vatican II?
Well, if you're a real church history nerd, I have another book, much longer and more niche, but it's called The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, and it's about this deep history of reform, some successful, some that failed, and so really kind of making the story of Vatican II back into the 18th century and movements for vernacular liturgy and the relationship of Pope and Bishop, all kinds of stuff. So this is really a story that I think really you can begin in the 1700s. It rolls all the way to Vatican II and continues, right? We're still having important debates that touch upon these exact same themes. And I find that exciting and hopeful. It can be stressful and neuralgic, but I think that it's really healthy for us to be having the ecclesiological debates that we're having. And I think ultimately good will come from it.
Oh, definitely. Thank you very much, Dr. Blanchsrd. And thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to start reading Lumen Gentium, paragraph by paragraph. We have the first 2 paragraphs tomorrow. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can be a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, like reading plans or things like that, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information.